Imagine a financial flow. Just think about this. So vast, it could dwarf the entire UK economy, maybe 10 times over in just 1 year.
That's the kind of scale some researchers are estimating for the wealth transferred from India to Britain during the colonial era. It's staggering.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really core question in global history. How do these colonial transfers from India to Britain actually work? And, maybe more importantly, why do they still matter?
We'll be looking closely at the work of Professor Utsa Patnaik, which, builds on some earlier ideas like the drain of wealth theory.
Right, and the crucial insight here, the thing to grasp, is that Britain's industrial rise wasn't just a story of homegrown innovation. It seems it was, heavily subsidized by wealth extracted from India.
Exactly. And what's fascinating, I think, is how these historical economic currents are just fundamental to understanding the shape of global capitalism today. It's not just looking back, it's seeing how the patterns, the dynamics of economic power were actually established.
Absolutely. So our mission today in this deep dive is to truly understand the mechanisms behind these transfers, the sheer volume of resources involved, and how this really challenges that conventional story we often hear about Britain's Industrial Revolution and, the whole evolution of global capitalism.
We'll be drawing on economic research, historical analyses, and specifically Professor Patnaik's, pretty groundbreaking methodologies.
So where do we start? The original drain of wealth theory.
Yeah, I think that's the natural starting point. It was championed by Indian nationalists back in the 19th century, people like Dadabhai, Naoroji, or
Right.
Dutt. Their core argument, basically, was that the British colonial regime was systematically siphoning off a huge chunk of India's tax revenue to fund its own expenses back home in Britain.
They saw it as this fundamental injustice, didn't they? India's resources benefiting Britain, but without any fair return.
Precisely. And while these early thinkers, they correctly spotted this crucial link of the connection between India's budget and its external financial flows, which is quite unique to a colonial setup. They didn't really have the sophisticated economic tools, the macroeconomic concepts we use today to fully analyze the scale and the impact.
Okay, so they saw the problem, but couldn't quite measure it in modern terms.
You could put it that way. And that's really where Professor Patnaik's work comes in and becomes so, revolutionary.
How so?
She's developed a much more rigorous methodological framework. It helps us understand not just that these transfers happen, but how they happened, the precise mechanisms, and crucially, how to estimate their true magnitude.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Because Patnaik's research, it directly confronts that traditional narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The story of Britain's Industrial Revolution being purely internal, self-driven.
Oh, absolutely. It challenges it head on. The sources we're looking at today suggest a very, very different picture.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, for instance, Patnaik points to data showing that even back in the 18th century, just before Britain's big industrial push, the actual amount of grain produced per person in Britain was declining.
Declining, that seems counterintuitive if they were about to industrialize.
Exactly. It directly challenges that common idea of a preceding agricultural revolution that supposedly freed up resources and labor for factories. And on top of that, Britain was heavily reliant on its colonies.
For raw materials, right, like cotton.
Yes, essential raw materials like cotton from India, but also even for basic food supplies, wage goods.
So Britain, this emerging industrial giant, was actually significantly dependent on resources from elsewhere.
Pretty much, yeah.
Which begs the question, how could they sustain this growth if they weren't producing enough themselves and needed all these imports?
And the answer, according to this research, lies squarely in these colonial transfers.
Right. So let's get into the mechanics. How do they do it initially?
Okay, so the initial mechanism, especially after the East India Company got the Diwani rights, the right to collect taxes in Bengal in 1765.
Right, 1765.
Was remarkably simple in a way. A significant chunk of the taxes paid by Indians was directly used by the company to purchase goods from India.
Wait, let me get this straight.
Yeah.
They used Indian tax money to pay Indian merchants for Indian products.
That's it.
So Britain was essentially acquiring these imports for free.
Effectively, yes, for free. And it gets better from Britain's perspective. They were then re-exporting many of these Indian goods, textiles, spices, etc., to other countries in Europe and elsewhere, generating even more wealth for Britain.
Wow. So tax revenue becomes free goods, which then become export profits.
Precisely. And the scale was enormous. Patnaik's revised estimates suggest that by around 1800, Britain's total trade, significantly boosted by these re-exports, might have reached something like 58% of its GDP.
58%. That's huge. Much higher than the usual figures you see.
Much higher. It really underscores the importance of these colonial goods. But the method did evolve.
Okay, how did it change?
Well, after the East India Company lost its trade monopoly in the early 19th century, the dynamic shifted. India actually started becoming a major importer of British manufactured goods, particularly textiles from Lancashire.
So the trade balance shifted, India buying more from Britain.
Yes. Which, created a new challenge for Britain if they wanted to keep extracting resources in the same way. How do you maintain the flow of wealth out of India when India is technically buying more from you?
Good question. So how do they manage that?
The key was maintaining control over India's earnings from its own exports to the rest of the world. India still exported lots of agricultural goods, raw materials, opium, things the world wanted.
Okay.
So Britain established a new financial instrument, this is crucial, the Council Bill, created around 1861.
Council Bill. Okay.
Think of it like this. Britain set up a kind of financial toll booth for all of India's international trade earning.
A toll booth. How did that work?
Foreign merchants, say in America or Europe, who wanted to buy Indian goods like cotton or jute.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't pay India directly. Instead, they'd purchase these council bills in London. They'd pay for them in sterling or gold or other acceptable foreign currencies.
Right, so the payment happens in London.
Yes. And that money, the valuable foreign exchange, went directly into the British government's coffers in London, specifically the India office.
Okay, I think I'm following. Britain gets the foreign currency. What about the Indian producer, the farmer or merchant who actually exported the goods? How did they get paid?
That's the ingenious or perhaps insidious part. The Indian exporters were paid, but they were paid in rupees.
Okay, in local currency. Where
Sure.
does rupees come from?
Not from the foreign exchange paid in London. No, the rupees came from the Indian domestic budget. It was drawn from the tax revenues collected within India.
From India taxes?
Yes. It was accounted for under a budget heading often called expenditure in England or expenditure abroad.
So let me recap. Foreigners buy Indian goods. They pay Britain in London with pounds or gold. Britain keeps that foreign currency. The Indian exporter gets paid in rupees, but those rupees come from Indian taxes already collected by the British administration.
You've got it. Indian exporters were effectively being paid using their own tax money.
Wow.
The Council Bill system created this direct link, bridging India's internal budget, its tax revenues, and its international trade accounts. All the valuable foreign currency earned by India's exports was immediately diverted to London. It never circulated within the Indian economy itself.
That is, a clever, if deeply exploitative system.
Mm-hmm.
India earns the hard currency, but Britain pockets it, and India pays for its own exports out of its own taxes.
Precisely. And to really understand the economic impact, Professor Patnaik argues we need to modify standard macroeconomic models.
Yeah, right, because a standard model for a sovereign nation wouldn't capture this drain. So even when India was selling more goods to the world than it was buying, the financial benefit, the foreign exchange earned, was systematically siphoned off to Britain through these invisible charges.
Precisely. The drain itself can be estimated by looking at either NX1, the commodity surplus that was appropriated, or GA, the expenditure abroad financed by taxes. But Patnaik argues both of these actually underestimate the total extraction.
Why underestimate them?
Because they don't fully capture the element of forced borrowing, the debt that India was often pushed into to cover these imposed charges when the commodity surplus wasn't quite enough.
Right. It's a multi-layered extraction. And then, didn't the value of the rupee itself complicate things further?
Oh, absolutely. Adding insult to injury, as you said earlier. From the late 19th century onwards, the Indian rupee experienced a continuous decline in its exchange value against the pound sterling.
Okay, so the rupee got weaker. How did that affect the drain?
Well, remember that expenditure in England, GA, had to be paid in sterling. If the rupee weakened, it took more rupees to buy the same amount of pounds.
So the cost in rupees of funding Britain's expenses went up.
Exactly. To cover this rising rupee cost, the colonial government had two main options. Either divert an even larger share of India's existing tax revenue away from domestic needs, or simply raise taxes on the Indian population. Both happened, and the result was often severe deflationary pressure on the Indian economy, squeezing demand, hindering growth.
The research we looked at includes a table, doesn't it? Showing government revenue and that expenditure in England over time.
Yes, and it really illustrates this. You see India's total government revenue growing, but you also see the expenditure in England growing, often faster, and its share of the total budget steadily increasing. It's a clear visual resources being systematically funneled out.
Just relentless pressure.
Patnaik actually estimated the impact of just the rupee's depreciation. Between 1871 and 1901, she calculated it created an additional tax burden of about 88 crores purely because the rupee weakened.
88 crores just from currency depreciation.
Yes. But because the actual amount of spending Britain demanded in sterling also increased during that period, the total actual additional burden extracted from India was much higher, around 141 crores.
And where did that extra money come from?
It was largely squeezed out of ordinary Indians, higher land taxes, which hit peasants hard, and regressive indirect taxes on essential goods like salt, kerosene, things people couldn't avoid buying.
So it wasn't just numbers on a ledger. It had real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely devastating consequences in many cases.